David Carter stepped onto the strange alien planet, Sci-Fi, feeling both excited and nervous. The air was crisp, slightly heavier than Earth's, and carried a faint scent of something sweet. The towering buildings around him shimmered under the twin suns, glowing with an otherworldly light. The sky above was a mix of deep blue and violet, filled with floating orbs of energy that moved like slow-falling stars. David was here on a peaceful mission, representing Earth in the Galactic Alliance. His job was simple: learn about the Sci-Fi culture, make connections, and avoid any trouble. He had no idea that within minutes his entire life would change. As he walked through the grand marketplace, he saw strange but beautiful creatures. Some had long, flowing tendrils instead of hair, while others had glowing patterns on their skin that pulsed like waves. The Sci-Fians were tall, elegant beings with smooth silver skin and deep golden eyes. They carried themselves with grace, moving almost like dancers in slow motion. David stopped near a merchant selling floating blue fruits, fascinated by the way they spun in the air. He reached out to touch one but quickly pulled his hand back, remembering the strict diplomatic rules. Never touch anything without permission. Just then, someone bumped into him from behind. He stumbled slightly, his hand instinctively grabbing onto the nearest person for balance. He barely registered the soft, silk-like fabric beneath his fingers before he let go and turned to apologize. The marketplace fell silent. Every Sci-Fian around him froze in place, their golden eyes widening in shock. The air grew heavier, as if the planet itself was holding its breath. David's stomach twisted. What just happened? He looked at the person he had touched, a woman, but not just any woman. She was taller than the others, dressed in a royal blue robe embroidered with silver patterns that shimmered under the suns. Her golden eyes locked onto him with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something else, something dangerous. David raised his hands in surrender. I didn't mean to. Before he could finish his sentence, a group of heavily armed guards appeared from nowhere, surrounding him in a tight circle. Their weapons hummed with energy, pointed directly at his chest. A deep voice boomed across the marketplace. By the sacred laws of Sci-Fi, the human has touched Lady Seraphina. He is now bound by the eternal law of marriage. David's mind went blank. Marriage? What? He let out a nervous laugh, looking around to see if this was some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe a bad joke, but the expressions on the Sci-Fians' faces told him otherwise. He turned back to the woman, Lady Seraphina. She wasn't smiling. Her face was unreadable, but her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. David took a slow step back. There must be some mistake. I didn't mean to touch her. It was an accident. The guard who had spoken, a tall warrior with silver markings on his forehead, narrowed his eyes. Intent does not matter. Human. The law is absolute. David's pulse pounded in his ears. His diplomatic training had prepared him for many things: language barriers, political debates, alien customs, but not this. His gaze darted to Seraphina, silently pleading for help. Surely she could say something to stop this. But instead of protesting, she tilted her head, studying him. Then, to his shock, she smirked. Welcome to Sci-Fi, husband. David felt the world spin around him. His legs went weak. This couldn't be real. And yet, the deadly seriousness in everyone's eyes told him it was. David stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The entire marketplace still watched in stunned silence, their golden eyes fixed on him like he had committed some unthinkable crime. But it wasn't a crime. It was an accident. Yet, somehow, he had ended up engaged to an alien noblewoman. The guards didn't lower their weapons. The energy humming from their spears made the air feel charged, as if the very atmosphere had turned against him. He swallowed hard, raising his hand slowly. Look, there has to be a way to fix this, David said, keeping his voice calm. I didn't know about this law. No one told me. The lead guard's golden eyes didn't waver. Ignorance of the law does not exempt one from it. David opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, Seraphina stepped forward. Every single guard immediately straightened, as if just her movement commanded absolute respect. "Lower your weapons," she said. The authority in her voice was undeniable. The guards hesitated for only a second before obeying, stepping back and forming a protective circle instead of an aggressive stance. David let out a breath of relief until she turned her piercing gaze on him. Up close, her features were almost too perfect, as if she had been sculpted from silver and gold. Her hair, a deep shade of shimmering platinum, cascaded down her back like liquid metal. But her eyes, those sharp, unreadable golden eyes, held something else. Amusement, challenge, maybe even curiosity. "You are in a difficult position, human," she said smoothly. "Do you understand the consequences of what you've done?" David hesitated. He wasn't entirely sure. From what he gathered, he had touched a noblewoman, which apparently meant he was now bound to marry her. But surely there was a way out. "Can't we just undo this?" he asked hopefully. "Like, I don't know, annul it." Seraphina's smirk widened slightly. "There is no annulment in Sci-Fi law. A touch is a bond is a promise, and a promise is sacred." David's stomach sank. Before he could say another word, she turned on her heel. "Follow me." The guards didn't give him a choice. 2 of them flanked him, their movements making it clear that if he tried to run, he wouldn't get far. David sighed. This was turning into the worst diplomatic mission of his life. They led him through the towering city, where glowing bridges stretched over vast, floating gardens. Strange creatures, some with translucent wings, hovered in the air, while others slithered through the glass-like streets. David barely had time to admire the beauty of the city before they arrived at a massive palace carved from obsidian and gold. It was easily the grandest structure he had ever seen. The twin suns reflected off its towering spires, making it seem like it was on fire. The guards led him inside, through halls lined with intricate murals that seemed to shift and change when he looked at them too long. Finally, they entered a large chamber, where an imposing figure sat upon a throne carved from crystal. The Sci-Fi emperor. His presence alone was overwhelming. He was taller than any being David had ever seen, his silver skin carrying the same glowing markings as Seraphina's but far more elaborate. His golden eyes locked onto David with unreadable intensity. David's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment of truth. The emperor's voice was deep and powerful. "You are the human who has bound himself to my daughter." David felt a cold sweat form on his neck. Daughter? His heart sank. He hadn't just touched any noblewoman. He had touched the emperor's hair. Seraphina crossed her arms, looking completely unfazed. "He is untrained, unprepared, and completely unaware of our ways," she said. "It is amusing." The emperor raised an eyebrow. "And you, my daughter, do you accept this bond?" David held his breath. This was it, the moment she could end this mess. She could tell her father she didn't want this, and they could both go their separate ways. But Seraphina simply smiled. "Of course, father." David's heart stopped. "What?" Before he could even protest, the emperor leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. "Then the wedding will proceed in 3 cycles." David felt his legs go weak. This couldn't be happening. Seraphina turned to him, her golden eyes shimmering with something dangerous. "I hope you're ready, husband-to-be." David sat in a grand chamber, his mind still reeling from the shocking turn of events. The Sci-Fi palace was unlike anything he had ever seen. Walls made of crystalline metal, shifting murals that seemed almost alive, and floating orbs that cast an ethereal glow across the vast, domed ceiling. But none of it could distract him from the looming disaster he now found himself in. He was engaged to an alien princess. He hadn't even been on Sci-Fi for a full day before managing to entangle himself in royal politics, ancient traditions, and what was possibly the biggest misunderstanding of his life. David rubbed his temples. Maybe this was all a nightmare. Maybe he'd wake up back on his ship, realizing he had simply eaten something weird before landing. But no, the two heavily armored guards standing near the entrance, their glowing energy weapons humming softly, were very real. So was the fact that he had mere cycles before an official ceremony bound him to Serafina, permanently. He had to find a way out of this. A soft chime rang out, and a moment later, a strange, hovering automaton entered the chamber. Its sleek, silver body shifted and morphed, adjusting its size until it was no taller than David's waist. "The princess requests your presence," the automaton said in a voice that sounded both melodic and artificial. David groaned but stood up. He wasn't in a position to refuse. The guards flanked him as he followed the automaton through the palace halls. Everywhere he looked, Sci-Fian nobles and courtiers whispered behind elegant golden masks, their luminous eyes tracking his every move. David felt like an exhibit on display, the strange human who had unknowingly bound himself to their future empress. Finally, the automaton led him to a sprawling balcony overlooking the city. Twin moons hung low in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the futuristic skyline. Serafina stood at the edge, her long, platinum hair catching the soft light. She didn't turn around as he approached. "You are struggling with this." David exhaled sharply. "Struggling. That's one way to put it. I was just supposed to be here for trade negotiations. Now I'm about to be married to a woman I barely know." Serafina finally turned, her golden eyes meeting his. There was something in them, not just amusement, but curiosity. "Do you think this is a punishment?" she asked. David hesitated. "Isn't it?" A slight smirk tugged at her lips. "You don't understand, do you?" He crossed his arms. "Enlighten me." Serafina stepped closer, her movements slow, deliberate. "Among my people, a bond formed by touch is the rarest of unions. It is considered sacred, a union of fate, rather than arrangement." David frowned. "You're telling me people don't usually choose their partners?" Serafina shook her head. "Most marriages among nobility are political. But you are something unexpected. The first human to ever trigger the ancient bond." That made David pause. "Wait, are you saying this has never happened before?" Serafina tilted her head. "Not in recorded history." David felt his stomach drop. This wasn't just some minor inconvenience. This was a historical anomaly. Before he could process that, Serafina took another step closer. Too close. David's breath caught as she reached up and lightly traced a single finger along the inside of his wrist. A sudden warmth surged through him, as if something ancient and unseen had awakened beneath his skin. His heart pounded. Serafina studied his reaction, her golden eyes sharp. "You feel it, don't you?" David swallowed hard. "What was that?" She smiled. "The bond." His pulse raced. This wasn't just some outdated tradition. There was something real here, something unnatural. But before he could demand answers, a deep, resounding chime echoed through the palace. The guards immediately snapped to attention. Serafina's expression darkened. "We have a problem." David felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of problem? She turned toward the palace interior. "Someone has challenged the bond." His stomach twisted. "What does that mean?" Serafina's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge of tension. "It means someone wants to fight for the right to claim me." David blinked. "Fight? Like in court?" Serafina smirked. "No, David. Fight as in combat." He felt the blood drain from his face. Oh, great. Now he had to survive an alien duel. David stood frozen, his mind racing. A duel? He had barely wrapped his head around the forced marriage, and now someone wanted to fight him over it. Serafina turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You do not have to accept the challenge." That caught him off guard. "I don't." She shook her head. "You are not Sci-Fian. The council would allow you to refuse, But if you decline, they will interpret it as forfeiting your claim to me." David let out a sharp breath. "So I either fight or walk away." Seraphina's gaze didn't waver. "Yes." He rubbed the back of his neck. "And what happens if I do fight?" Her golden eyes darkened. "Then you must win." That wasn't exactly reassuring. "And if I don't?" She hesitated before answering. "You won't die, if that's what you fear. But losing would bring you great dishonor. You would be cast out of Sci-Fian society. And depending on who wins, I may not have a choice in the outcome." David clenched his fists. He wasn't sure why, but the idea of Seraphina being forced into a bond she didn't want made his blood boil. "Who challenged me?" he asked. Seraphina's expression hardened. "General Kalis." Even the guards tensed at the name. David frowned. "I take it that's bad." Seraphina exhaled slowly. "He is the High Warlord of Typhor, a warrior who has never been defeated in combat." David felt his stomach drop. Of course, it couldn't be some random noble with no fighting experience. It had to be the undefeated warlord of an alien species. Fantastic. A low hum filled the chamber as a holographic display flickered to life in the air. The image of a towering Sci-Fian male appeared. Dark silver armor, deep violet skin, and piercing emerald eyes. His presence radiated sheer dominance. "Human." Kalis's voice was deep, authoritative. "You are unworthy of this bond. Step aside." David squared his shoulders. "And if I don't?" A smirk tugged at the warlord's lips. "Then you fight." David had never been in a real fight in his life. At least, nothing beyond the occasional bar scuffle back on Earth. But something inside him refused to back down. Maybe it was the challenge in Kalis's voice. Maybe it was the way Seraphina watched him, waiting for his answer. Maybe it was the realization that, somehow, he had gotten himself into something far bigger than he understood. "Fine," David said. "I accept." A murmur rippled through the palace as Kalis's smirk widened. "Then we settle this at first light." The hologram vanished. Seraphina let out a slow breath. That was reckless. David shrugged. "Yeah, well, I'm kind of out of good options here." She stepped closer, studying him carefully. "You do not understand what you have done." "Probably not," he admitted, "but I guess I'll figure it out." A pause. Then, to his surprise, Seraphina smiled. It wasn't condescending. It wasn't mocking. It was almost approving. "Then I will prepare you." David blinked. "Wait, what?" She turned, motioning for him to follow. "You will not survive against Kalis as you are now. If you want to win, we have much work to do." David hesitated, then sighed. "Guess I don't have a choice. Huh." Seraphina glanced back at him, her golden eyes glinting. "You always have a choice. But now that you have chosen, I will make sure you do not regret it." David wasn't sure whether to be relieved or terrified. But one thing was clear. There was no turning back now. David stood in the dimly lit training chamber, his heartbeat a steady drum of anxiety and determination. The Typhorian palace had many wonders, but at this moment, all he cared about was the circular arena before him, a space of stone and metal where warriors trained for war. And today, he was the one who had to learn how to fight. Seraphina stepped forward, her posture poised and confident. She wasn't wearing her usual regal attire. Instead, she was dressed in the light, flexible armor of a Sci-Fian combatant. "We do not have much time," she said, golden eyes studying him. "You need to be ready by sunrise." David rubbed the back of his neck. "Yeah, about that. I'm not exactly a seasoned warrior." Seraphina smirked. "I know." She reached out, tapping a console embedded in the stone wall. Immediately, the chamber shifted. Sections of the floor retracted, revealing racks of weapons, energy shields, and strange floating drones. The walls hummed as energy fields flickered to life, casting eerie glows across the space. David swallowed. This was starting to feel a lot more real. "We will start with defense," Serafina said. Callus is stronger than you, faster than you, and more experienced than you. Wow, thanks for the confidence boost. She ignored his sarcasm. Your advantage lies in unpredictability. You are human. You do not fight as we do. Use that. David glanced at the weapons. So, do I get a plasma sword or something? Serafina shook her head. You would not last 10 seconds with one. David frowned. Then what do I use? She tossed something small and metallic at him. He caught it clumsily, looking down at what appeared to be a simple baton. A stick. You're giving me a stick. Serafina's lips curled into a sly smile. Try to hit me. David hesitated. I don't really want to. Wham! Before he could finish, Serafina moved. In a blur, she swept his legs out from under him, and David hit the ground with a painful thud. Ow! What the hell? Serafina offered him a hand. You hesitate. That will get you killed. David groaned, pulling himself up. Okay, lesson learned. No hesitation. She gestured at him again. Now, try to hit me. David gripped the baton and lunged. He wasn't a trained fighter, but he played enough pickup basketball back on Earth to know how to fake someone out. At the last second, he twisted his body and aimed for her ribs, only for Serafina to effortlessly dodge and slam the side of her palm into his shoulder, sending him stumbling. Better, she admitted, but still not good enough. David exhaled sharply. Okay, again. They repeated the exercise over and over. Each time, he got a little faster, a little sharper. He wasn't anywhere close to Serafina's level, but he was learning, adapting. As the hours passed, David found himself thinking less and reacting more. His movements became instinctual, his steps more fluid. He wasn't just swinging wildly anymore. He was reading Serafina's shifts in stance, predicting her next move. Finally, after what felt like the 100th attempt, he saw it, an opening. Without thinking, he feinted left, pivoted, and struck. Crack! The baton connected with Serafina's forearm. She didn't flinch, but her golden eyes flickered with something new. Approval. Good. David panted, wiping sweat from his brow. I actually hit you. Yes. She stepped back, lowering her stance. Now let's see if you can survive against something more aggressive. David barely had time to react before the training drones activated. Blindingly fast, they shot toward him, glowing weapons in hand. This time, there was no warning, no time to think. David's instincts took over. He dodged the first strike, ducked under the second, and spun out of the way of a sweeping energy blade. His heart pounded as he countered with the baton, knocking one drone off course before another came at him from behind. Serafina watched, her arms crossed. Adapt, David. Use your instincts. He gritted his teeth, blocking a strike, and using the momentum to flip over the attacker. He had no idea how he pulled it off, but it worked. The more he fought, the more he realized something strange. He wasn't completely terrible at this. Maybe it was adrenaline. Maybe it was survival instinct. But for the first time since this madness began, David felt like he actually stood a chance. The training session stretched long into the night, and as the artificial sun of the Typhorian palace began to rise, David wasn't the same helpless human he had been the day before. He was still outmatched, but now he was ready. The twin moons of Typhor hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the grand palace. Inside, deep within the ornate halls, David stood in front of an enormous mirror, adjusting the ceremonial robes draped over his shoulders. The fabric shimmered, shifting in color as it caught the light, woven with some alien material he couldn't name. Tonight was the night. His challenge against Callus was inevitable. The moment he had mistakenly touched Serafina, the Typhorian law had bound them together, triggering a chain of events that spiraled beyond his control. Now he had to prove himself, not just to the council, not just to Seraphina, but to an entire empire that saw him as unworthy. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Seraphina stepped inside, her usual regal confidence dimmed just slightly. She studied him for a moment before speaking. "You look adequate." David let out a nervous chuckle. "I'll take that as a compliment." She walked closer, adjusting the folds of his robe with a delicate touch. "The council chamber is prepared. The nobles have gathered. Kalis will be waiting." David took a deep breath. "And you're sure there's no way out of this?" Seraphina's gaze hardened. "If you run, you will confirm their beliefs. That you are weak. That you do not deserve to stand beside me." David met her eyes. "And if I lose?" She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough. He already knew the answer. Losing wasn't an option. Seraphina finally spoke. "Come. It is time." The grand chamber was unlike anything David had ever seen. A massive domed structure with towering crystalline walls, it glowed with ethereal energy, pulsating with the breath of the empire itself. Thousands of Typhorians filled the space, their luminescent eyes fixed on the center, where David and Kalis stood, facing each other. Kalis was a warrior in every sense of the word. Towering, broad-shouldered, his dark armor reflecting the glow of the chamber. His piercing gaze bore into David with undisguised contempt. "This is a waste of time," Kalis sneered, his voice carrying through the chamber. "You are not one of us. You do not belong here." David clenched his fists. "Yeah, well, too bad. I'm here anyway." A low murmur rippled through the crowd at his defiance. Kalis merely smirked. High Chancellor Vena raised a hand, silencing the whispers. Her voice rang through the chamber with the weight of ancient authority. "By law, this human has laid claim to Princess Seraphina. By law, his worth must be tested. Let the trial of ascendancy begin." The floor beneath them shifted, symbols glowing to life. David braced himself. He had trained for this. He had prepared. But nothing could have truly prepared him for what came next. Kalis moved. Fast. David barely saw the first attack before he was dodging, rolling out of the way as Kalis's energy-forged blade sliced through the air where he had been standing just seconds before. The crowd erupted in cheers and gasps. David pushed himself up, gripping the weapon Seraphina had given him, a staff of condensed plasma. Humming with power, it felt heavier now, the weight of expectation pressing down on him. Kalis lunged again, a blur of steel and fury. David blocked. Barely. The force of the impact sent him skidding backward, his arms screaming in protest. Kalis was stronger, faster, and had years of experience over him. But David had something else. He had unpredictability. He faked a stumble, letting Kalis think he was vulnerable. As Kalis went for the finishing blow, David twisted at the last second, using his momentum against him. Crack. The staff connected with Kalis's side, sending him stumbling. The crowd gasped. Kalis recovered quickly, but now there was something new in his expression. Surprise. David exhaled sharply. He had landed a hit, a single hit, but it was enough to shift the energy of the battle. Now he just had to survive long enough to turn that into a victory. The chamber was silent, so silent that David could hear the faint hum of energy crackling around him. Thousands of Zyphorian eyes bore down on him, watching, waiting. Kalis straightened, his stance more rigid now, his pride clearly stung by the fact that a mere human had landed a blow on him. David tightened his grip on the plasma staff. His heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't afford to show fear. Not now. Kalis smirked, rolling his shoulders. "I'll admit, you're not as weak as I thought. But you're still out of your depth." Without warning, he lunged again. David barely dodged. The air cracked as Kalis's blade sliced inches from his face, the sheer force of the swing sending a gust of energy rippling through the chamber. He twisted his body, ducking low, and countered with a sweeping strike aimed at Kalis's legs. Kilang. Kalis blocked effortlessly, the shockwave from the impact reverberating up David's arms. He gritted his teeth. His advantage was unpredictability, but Kalis was adapting. Fast. The crowd roared as Kalis pushed forward, launching a relentless onslaught of attacks. David dodged, blocked, rolled, his mind working on overdrive to keep up. He was losing ground. Seraphina's words echoed in his mind. If you run, you will confirm their beliefs. If you lose, they will take everything from you. No, he refused to lose. David feinted left, then spun sharply, bringing his staff around in a full arc. Kalis saw it coming and moved to block. But that was the trap. At the last second, David shifted his stance, twisting his momentum into a powerful upward strike instead. The blow connected squarely with Kalis's wrist, sending his blade flying. The crowd gasped. Kalis staggered back, cradling his arm, his expression shifting from arrogant confidence to undisguised fury. For a split second, David felt a surge of triumph. But it vanished the moment he saw Kalis's eyes glow. The air around them changed. A deep, ancient power surged through Kalis's body, his aura flaring like a raging storm. David barely had time to brace before Kalis slammed into him with inhuman force. Crack! Pain exploded through David's ribs as he was lifted off his feet and sent hurtling backward. His body crashed onto the smooth crystalline floor, the impact rattling every bone in his body. The crowd erupted in deafening cheers and gasps. David coughed, struggling to push himself up. Every breath was agony. Kalis loomed over him now, his power surging, his expression one of pure, unrestrained fury. This wasn't about the duel anymore. Kalis wasn't just trying to win. He was trying to break him. David clenched his fists, his vision swimming. The logical part of his brain told him to stay down, that this fight was over. But then he heard a voice. Stand up. Seraphina. She hadn't moved from her place on the high days, but her voice carried with absolute command. The nobles turned toward her in shock, a princess showing open support for a challenger. Unheard of. Kalis turned his head slightly. That fraction of a distraction was all David needed, summoning every ounce of strength left in his battered body. He kicked out hard, sweeping Kalis's legs from beneath him. The warrior crashed to the ground. The chamber fell deathly silent. David struggled to his feet, his entire body trembling. He grabbed his staff, standing over Kalis, breathing raggedly. You think I'm weak, David said, his voice hoarse but steady. But I'm still standing. Kalis's chest heaved, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he lowered his gaze. The entire chamber froze. It took David a second to realize what had just happened. Kalis had submitted. The air buzzed with stunned energy. Nobles murmured, some in outrage, others in awe. David turned, his gaze meeting Seraphina's. Something unspoken passed between them. Then, High Chancellor Vena's voice rang through the chamber. By law, the human has proven his worth. David exhaled. He had done it. But as he looked around, he realized something else. Winning the fight was just the beginning.